Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, home of cheesesteaks, where the Eagles soar, the Phillies trot, and the Flyers fly. Location of America's revolutionary birth and electricity's experimental growth. This place has a history that is cloaked in as much mystery as in delectable fact. Hello, I am Jared Boosters. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to take a deep dive into the oldest streets of Philadelphia, hoping to unearth a history which has rarely been discussed before. In this series of videos, I intend to focus on the oldest photographs of these cities, which we may use to interpret the narrative in a different way. Today, we will focus on a select set of images of Philadelphia, including images from private collections, which took a little bit of elbow grease for me to gain access to. Hopefully, these images, along with a brief overview of the current narrative and my unique sense of humor, will drive your quest for knowledge on Old World Philadelphia. Now, according to the current narrative, all signs point to William Penn as the key player in developing the area of Philadelphia. However, I'd like to take a look deeper into the narrative and tie together a few loose ends that paint a slightly different picture. While it is true, in 1681, the current narrative says King Charles II of England granted William Penn the land of Pennsylvania, which at the time also included parts of modern-day Delaware and Maryland. Within the same narrative, we also have a few incongruities which I'd like to address. In my Old World video I made previously about Baltimore, we discussed how Susquehannock Native Americans, those of immense size and stature, occupied the area of Baltimore before European civilization. What I did not read in the Baltimore narrative history, but is addressed in the history of Philadelphia, is the fact that the Susquehannock, at least throughout the 1600s, actually had an alliance with the Dutch colony. More specifically, when it comes to the area of Baltimore and also the area of Philadelphia, the Susquehannock had a close relationship and alliance with the new Swedish colony, or New Sweden. This is important not only in identifying the benefactors and deals that were made for these lands, but also in the construction or founding of these cities. While William Penn's grant did permit him the lands of modern-day Pennsylvania, Delaware, and parts of Maryland, the southernmost part of these lands were already occupied and had been separately granted to Lord Baltimore of Maryland. We've discussed in previous videos about Lord Baltimore's decades-long war with the Susquehannock natives of the area of Baltimore and the surrounding lands. And now we can add to that information that the Susquehannock natives were actually in an alliance with and fighting alongside New Sweden. Of note here are two major factors given within this narrative. One is the fact that at some point around 1640, the colony of New Sweden, living with the Susquehannock, are said to have been functioning independently from the larger Dutch colony. So much so that New Sweden is said to have developed its own militia, religious and judicial buildings, and independent settlements, which refused interactions with the larger Dutch colony. At this point, we can only assume that the new Swedish colony and the Susquehannock occupied much of the land between Baltimore and Philadelphia, as they are featured frequently in the 1600s historical records of both of these areas.
Of note is the remaining Dutch, Swedish, and even some of the British in William Penn's new colony who did not want to be there actually went and formed their own colony in 1704, and this would become Delaware. Now, at the same time, with a focus on New Sweden and how they were tied to the Susquehannock Native Americans, we also have the people of New Sweden who wanted to veer off from both William Penn's colony and from the new colony of Delaware. So they actually created their own colony, which they called New Sweden, and New Sweden would eventually become known as modern-day New Jersey.
Now that brings me to the second major factor of note in this narrative. That is, when William Penn arrived to the New World after receiving his grant from King Charles II, The narrative says he was met with little to no resistance. So, upon arriving to the shores of what is now Newcastle, Delaware, the narrative says, and I quote, "An orderly change of government ensued." Now, this is a hard part of the narrative to grasp. While initially conflicts between the British colonists and Lord Baltimore's already established group are noted in the 1650s, this narrative alludes to that by the 1680s, William Penn was able to arrive and lay claim to the land without much, if any, physical conflict. Now, this also leads to a conflict of interest when we discuss the lands specifically in Philadelphia and the surrounding area. Earlier, in the official narrative of Philadelphia, and in the more concise version of the Philadelphia history that I read in a separate article, while the Susquehannock and New Sweden are completely left out, it is written that the Delaware Native Americans are who actually occupied Philadelphia at the time of William Penn's arrival. So, all forms of the narrative of the history of Philadelphia will confirm that William Penn actually purchased the lands that are today Philadelphia from the Delaware Native Americans after traveling upriver from Newcastle, Delaware, until reaching a spot of land which Penn had deemed fit to start a new and free society. That land was, of course, Philadelphia. So now we have Philadelphia, which is said to have been occupied by Delaware natives in the official narrative. But at the same time, it was also housing parts of New Sweden and this large colony of the Susquehannock. But all of these lands essentially are handed over to William Penn upon his arrival to this area. Now, one of the first things it says that William Penn inherits are the ancient mounds and earthworks of what is now Fairmount Park. To the Delaware Native Americans, this was their sacred land and where they lived within the larger Philadelphia area. If you've been to Philadelphia, you're probably familiar with Fairmount Park. Now, what's interesting to note is in the earliest depictions and artistic drawings of Fairmount Park from the late 1700s, you can definitely still make out many of the ancient burial mounds and earthworks. However, finding artistic depictions of Fairmount Park at later dates and when the construction of this area was changed are very difficult. I do believe it is very important to note, however, that this very large area was occupied by many native earthworks, and to question how many of these works were covered over or deconstructed to build the first city of Philadelphia is really interesting to me. Now, the last portion of this narrative I'd like to mention before diving into the freestyle portion of the video, where we look at the oldest and rarest museum kept photographs of Philly, is the interesting narrative given about Philadelphia in the early 1700s. While in 1683, Philadelphia is said to have had roughly 300 people living there, by 1701 the population is over 2,500. The port of Delaware became one of the largest ports of immigration into the New World, and many of the arrivals would head directly to Philadelphia to find work. Philadelphia became an agricultural powerhouse at this time and was considered to be the third leg of the trade triangle with Europe and Africa. However, this flourishing of the city came with many interesting downsides. While many, if not all, of the homes and buildings at this time seem to be constructed with brick and masonry, we have yet another set of two major conflicts that stand out in the narrative. First, this narrative states that when William Penn and his settlers first arrived to Philadelphia, many of them had to live in caves that were dug out of the riverbed. And two, if no skilled workers or architects arrived with William Penn, how did the city become completely masonry and brick built by the early to mid 1700s? For what reason would you head to the New World only to live like cavemen in caves that you dig out of a riverbed? To follow up on that question, the major issue with Philadelphia according to this narrative in the 1700s, was mud flooding. More specifically, we're told that the city was built out with these beautiful brick and masonry structures and continued to rapidly grow. However, we are also told in this narrative, without a specific reason given, that the streets were unpaved, unfinished, and susceptible to flooding during any minor weather event, which often rendered them impassable and caused the levels of the street to severely fluctuate. Luckily, if you want to call it that, we have a few very old pictures of Philadelphia from the 1850s and the 1860s, which illustrate just how deep the streets actually go, and this is what I want to get into now. In some instances, it appears the streets of Philadelphia had risen by anywhere from 10 to upwards of 40 feet in some locations. Also, interestingly, we can pinpoint specific brickwork on the lower unearthed levels, which seem to confirm a much earlier construction that existed there. Now, around this time period, we also have photographs of the original water tunnels of Philadelphia being quote-unquote renovated. And of note to me in these photographs is, while only a handful or less of them exist or were able to be found by me, we can see that this sewage or water tunnel has a circumference of at least 20 to maybe 30 feet and is large enough for a full-grown man to step inside and look rather small. Now, at the same time, this tunnel system in parts of Philadelphia appears to be at least 25 to 30 feet below the ground level. So if we add the circumference of the tunnel plus the overall depth that the tunnel is found, we can estimate that whoever built the tunnel had to have dug down roughly 50 to 60 feet just to install this water sewage tunnel. Now, another possibly more plausible idea is that the water tunnel was once right below or very close to the surface, and over time, the land above the tunnel packed on and was raised to the point that the tunnel became buried so deeply. And this actually lends to the narrative we just talked about, how the streets were unpaved and they were often flooded and their level would fluctuate. But what I found really interesting is that these are not modern day excavation photographs. We see many excavations of modern day cities, and then we find uncovered lower levels or levels that were buried under the ground, and this sort of leads us to the flood of mud discussion that we talk about all the time. But what I found very interesting is these are excavation photographs from the 1800s, and even at this point we can see a lot of evidence of these deeply buried or deeply covered up streets, down to the point that the tunnels and even brickwork can be found 50 to 60 feet below ground level. Now, if you're not one who wants to believe that there was some sort of earth that packed on top of this tunnel, then the only other plausible option is that in the mid to late 1700s, we had the technology to dig 40 feet underground and construct a huge sewage tunnel system under the entire city of Philadelphia.
So that brings us right up to about the 1770s, and that's where I was going to stop talking about the narrative of Philadelphia, because from this point forward, a lot of us are very familiar with the history of the American Revolution. No taxation without representation, rebellion against the British, and Philadelphia played a key role with our founding fathers, the Declaration of Independence, etc., etc. But the next thing that I want to talk about that stood out to me about this narrative is that we have two major expos that are held in Philadelphia. One of them in the 1860s, which I could find absolutely zero photographs of. All we have are artistic depictions, and the other one being the Centennial Exposition in 1876, which celebrated the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, what was interesting about the second expo is it was also very, very difficult to find any number of photographs of this expo. I found a lot of drawings, countless,
handfuls of drawings and artistic depictions of the 1876 Centennial Expo, but what I did not have an easy time finding was actual, real photographs. And that's where we get into how I had to gain access to different museums. I actually had to apply and give my reason for wanting to download these images. And for each one, I actually had to apply and give a reason for before I was allowed access to these images. So I just wanted to share them with you because for Philadelphia being such an important city, and this expo in 1876 being the first expo that was held on American soil, that was officially an international exposition, it's really remarkable to me that there is such a lack of photographs of this event. Now, in all of the major expos that would follow after 1876, no matter where they are around the world, we really do see countless numbers of photographs. However, with this World's Fair in 1876 in Philadelphia, I was only able to find this selection of maybe 15 to 20 images. Now, luckily, they're from all different parts of the fair, including exterior and interior. However, this is not all of the buildings and not even close, because we see in the drawings some of these major, massive, huge buildings that are taking up multiple acres, just one building. Yet the images that I was able to provide don't really depict such a land. Although there are very interesting images in here. We have this one that is actually said to be the monorail that was running around the whole area of this exposition of 1876. And it's just really interesting because if you took this design and you would put a monorail like this in a modern day city, it would fit right in. It's got a very futuristic design. Found it very interesting. We also have the Statue of Liberty. We actually have her torch that was on display at this expo in 1876. Now, one of the modern day controversies behind this is that we're not allowed inside the torch anymore. So I found that really interesting, a sort of dichotomy that we put it on display and we wanted everyone to go inside of it in 1876, but in modern times we're not allowed inside. And many people point to a belief that something within the torch would indicate an old world construction. And let's just go through a few more of these interesting photographs from the 1876 Expo that I was able to get my hands on. You can see a lot of representations of the old world and a lot of indication of what was going on in Philadelphia and around the United States of America at that time. So now that we've had a brief overview about the history of Philadelphia before the American Revolution, I want to take a dive into some of these old world buildings that were said to be popping up in Philadelphia in the 18 and 1900s. Now, I'm not going to give a narrative about these buildings. I'm not going to read you any of the facts or anything like that, but I will chime in here and there when I see something interesting. Now, like I said before, many of these photographs are coming from private collections and museums, and I actually had to work to gain access to them. So hopefully within these images, we can find certain things that stick out or that we haven't noticed before that can help us to examine this narrative even further. And while I'm not going to give a lot of details about these buildings, I will start with this one right here. And if you didn't recognize it already, this is the City Hall of Philadelphia. And this building is the largest masonry built building in the entire world. And when it was completed in 1894, it was also the tallest occupiable building in the entire world. So this bad boy was really the cream of the crop when it comes to masonry built buildings. And this is completely built with bricks and masonry. There is no steel involved here. And this is absolutely fascinating. One of the most beautiful buildings I've ever seen. And to see it in person, it really is almost undescribable. Now, to tell you that it is a certain height, a certain width, a certain amount of bricks were used, this and that, only gives you a number. But to see this in person is absolutely breathtaking. There really is not a lot of words I can put behind it, so I just want to share the oldest images that I could find of this building. And one thing that we will note, and this is an interesting image to me, of course we have to have the Freemasons out front with their Freemason symbolism saying, oh yes, we're going to renovate this area. But realistically, no matter what you think about the old world and the old buildings, you have to note that having the largest masonry built building in the world is quite an accomplishment, and this building itself is absolutely beautiful and one of the most interesting buildings, I'd say, in the entire world. It's one of the first to employ an electric elevator, as well as many other features that I'm not going to get into right now. I will leave some links down below, as I will with many of these other images where I find it appropriate. But realistically, I just want to show these images to you and hear what you have to say about them down below. Something I found interesting is how similar all of the statues look to one another. Now, they're all dressed in different attire, but the actual human being that is depicted in these statues in Philadelphia and on City Hall are all very similar in appearance. And that's something I've been noticing a lot lately, especially when we look at statues from the old world. I've come to find more and more that it appears that the humans being depicted in these statues are all very similar, at least in makeup of their body, to one another. Now, they're all dressed differently, but they all have very similar features, and I just think that's really interesting. Now, we're given a sculptor here for this amazing statue of William Penn that is on top of City Hall in Philadelphia. And I just wanted to include some of these images with you just to show you the overall immense statue and how big it really is, because looking at modern day photographs, it doesn't really do justice to how massive this statue actually was. There are many historical schools and colleges that appeared in Philadelphia beginning in the 1800s, and many of them are either massive brick buildings or, like the University of Pennsylvania, actually appear like massive castles. And I don't know if it's greed or inheritance, but you can see again here that the land around the castle, the road is fully paved, yet when you go to the main street outside of this castle-like building, you can see that it is unpaved and unfinished. So a real dichotomy between even the people on the street and the large castle that sits 100 feet away. And I think the main thing that exposes the old world is the idea that we see these buildings that are basically built on these hills or built on these mounds or built at an awkward angle. Now imagine a building like that, especially one that massive. When you build it, you would first flatten the land so you could lay your infrastructure. Then you would construct your building. Now, what we're told is that they would fill in this land afterwards. So once the infrastructure was laid and the building was completed, to fill in where the infrastructure was laid, they would basically incorporate more land. But for some reason, they would not make the land level or flat. So when they were done with these buildings, we're told that they would just lay the land however it laid, basically. So if there were windows that were covered up, that was okay. There were windows that would be halfway coming out of the ground, that's okay. But on these same buildings that they say were designed this way, you'll have windows that are coming out of the ground in some areas. Other areas, the window is completely exposed like a normal building. But at the same time, on these same buildings, we'll see raised entrances. So if they were planning to fill in the land, why would they design it in a way where they would need a raised entrance and to build windows that would go into the ground? It's like two different design features that could be considered follies or flaws, yet we see them on numerous buildings in almost every single town all around the world. So I'm just wondering what sort of construction method that they were using, because in current times you don't really see them laying down the infrastructure for the building and then coming in and laying a bunch of dirt around the building so that the land around the building is uneven. Yet we're told that is exactly what they were doing all around the country and all around the world in the 1800s, so that we have these awkward buildings that appear halfway underground, halfway out of ground, with entrances and windows that are exactly the same way. It's just a really awkward design, and we even see it in old world Philadelphia. So I'm just gonna show you a couple more images that I found really interesting. Some of these really hard to find images and ones that I thought to be really important to share with you. So I'd love to hear anything that stands out to you down below, and I'll chime back in a little bit. In most videos in the Old World series, I find myself sort of scrambling to try and find these oldest photographs that I can. Most of the images are very scarce, but when it comes to Philadelphia and the turn of the century, talking about the late 1800s after the Exposition in 1876 and into the early 1900s, there are so many examples that I found of different buildings. In a lot of the Old World series, the other cities we look at, I'll be looking at the same building multiple times. We'll take a look at it from 3 or 4 different angles, and I love doing that because it gives you a real sort of blueprint in your head
for what the building looked like. But with this video about Philadelphia, we're just going through different building after different building after different building, and every single one as a standalone could have its own video made about it. It seems like a lot of these buildings are massive and they have this old world architecture that really signals a different sort of time period. What I want to present to you is the accoutrement of different architectural styles that have been attributed to Philadelphia, and the whole idea that by the early 1900s, by the turn of the century, there were multiple buildings in Philadelphia that were 100 feet tall and made out of brick and stone masonry. And that's all. And eventually most of these buildings were replaced. For the most part, you'll see that many of these buildings are no longer standing today, and I found it essential to be able to share these images with you, because when I look through them, it's really clear to me that the old world architecture and the stone and brick and masonry architecture in Philadelphia has been a key in determining what the real history of Philadelphia is. Red brick, raised entrance, windows into the ground. Red brick, raised entrance, windows into the ground. Now, if there was any representation of the old world in Philadelphia that I wanted to point out to you most, it would probably be this building right here. And this is the Eastern State Penitentiary, also known as ESP. And would you believe it? But the Eastern State Penitentiary is actually built on the Fairmount land. So back to the Native American ruins, or the mounds, or the ancient burial site, well,
this Eastern State Penitentiary sits right on top of that land. Now, this is a pretty wild building, especially when it comes to talking about the prison system and things like that. They say this was designed by a man named John Haviland in the year of 1829 is when this was completed. Now, this is considered to be the world's first penitentiary system, or the system where every cellmate or prisoner is jailed by themselves. So the whole idea is that you're separated from every other prisoner and you're basically isolated. Before this, you can picture jails much like, you know, in old Western movies where they just throw you in a cell with all your other bad guys, so to speak, and you're all kept there. But this Eastern State Penitentiary, which opened again in 1829 on the ancient native lands it was built on top of, housed some of the most notorious criminals of all time, including Al Capone and also this dog. So just really interesting. I just wanted to show you these pictures mainly and point out this architecture. We also have some really cool art museums throughout Philadelphia, including the Rodin Museum. So let me know what you think about the video so far in the comments down below. For the next part of the video, we're just going to dive back into some of these private collection museum kept photographs. And these are going to be some of the earliest photographs I could find of Philadelphia from the 1850s and 1860s. And these are going to be photographs from before the two major expos. So you can really start to notice some of the more intricate and very massive buildings that appear much larger than the population number that we're given. Although we're told that these were built by hand, by horse, by buggy, using the latest technology. And it's just a lot of interesting photographs that I'd never seen before, especially in accordance with Philadelphia history. So these are very interesting. A lot of them are from Philadelphia museums or from the Getty Museum. So sit back and enjoy. And let me know what you see. If anything stands out about these, let me know in the comments down below. I love to hear your thoughts, and we can tie it together in a follow-up video. But for now, let's take a deep dive into these oldest photographs of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, one of the more beautiful and kind of shocking things to me about this history is look at the amazing, seamless brickwork on this bridge. Now, all of these blocks are of a different size, and even when you look at the pillars that are on the bridge, they're all perfectly cut
and perfectly shaped. So in the 1800s, no matter what the area was, it appears, at least in Philadelphia, we were able to create these perfectly level bridges and things of that nature. Yet at the same time, we're told in the narrative we were not able to pave the roads or make roads that would not become flooded with mud. And it's just very interesting to see the sort of differences that we have from one building or one area in Philadelphia to another, and all these sort of anomalies within the narrative. Here's another image that really stood out to me, and that's simply for the fact that this bridge not only appears ancient already in this photograph, but parts of the bridge appear to fuse into the rock or the mountain or hillside right next to it. And this is the sort of idea that I see personally echoed in a lot of these photographs. The whole idea that we have this massive city and this massive block and stonework that seems to predate the people that are within the city, or the rocks themselves and the stones appear to be cut much earlier than the people who arrived to this area. This is actually a photograph from within Fairmount Park, and you can see these rocks and these stones when I zoom in on the image, and they appear to be precisely cut. However, that's up to you what you think is actually going on there, but it's just the same sort of thing. We can look at the post office here, which we looked at a few images of earlier, and again, it's a sort of rotunda shape. It's got a tower on top, and that was said to be the original post office constructed in Philadelphia. And a lot of these buildings have this old world nature to them, and they really appear, when you look at the different things about them, to have an influence that we can't explain with simply William Penn and the Quakers who came here and started living in caves. We have influences that seem to be outside of that realm and are much more important that we need to give credit to, and I would just like to acknowledge. And this is said to be the original Liberty Bell, or the first Liberty Bell, or the old Liberty Bell. So look how it's surrounded by a Phrygian cap and some other imagery that you might be familiar with. And Philadelphia appears to be a city that's full of imagery, that's full of Freemasonry, and full of all of these sort of secrets and unexplained changes and different things about the history that sort of have a winking eye, hand in the pocket, fingers crossed. That's at least what I took away when I looked at a lot of these images. A lot of them, even with the narrative that is given, are unexplainable, but I really did just want to present them to you because they are so unique to me. I really like sharing these images with you. I'm happy to read about Philadelphia, and I'm happy to share Old World Philadelphia with anyone who's willing to listen. So even if you didn't enjoy the narrative, even if you muted the video and just looked through these images, I still think anybody would be able to take something away from this. And I just want to say thank you for being here, and I really appreciate you being here. If you're still with me, hit that thumbs up below. I put a lot of work into this video. I know it's very rough. I know there's a lot more I could talk about and I plan to talk about in the future, but I wanted to get these images out there because I know nothing can be perfect, but the idea that the old world is something different than what we give it credit for, or what the mainstream gives it credit for, is an idea that can be conceptualized with these images. So I'm just glad to share them with you, and I thank you so much for being here. So, one of my favorite parts of Philadelphia, and something that I've enjoyed ever since I first started going there over a decade ago when I first got my license, is these beautiful murals that are always on these old world buildings all throughout the city of Philadelphia. Now, it's just something that you don't see everywhere you go, but it's something that has always stood out to me. And there's just a history in Philadelphia. Every time I've been there, it washes over your spirit. It really invigorates your mind just to see buildings like this. And especially even before I had an interest in the old world, the two things that stood out to me most were driving through the center of the city and seeing the city hall that we've looked at earlier in the video. And then I used to just walk through the city, the streets of Philadelphia, and see all these different murals. Now, it's been a couple years since I've been there, but I still think it's one of the most amazing and beautiful cities in the entire world. It is a city of brotherly love, and every time I've been there, I've only felt loved and appreciated, and I really felt uplifted by all the amazing architecture and the amazing artwork that can be found all throughout the city of Philadelphia. So I'm really happy to be able to share these images with you and just to be able to talk about Philadelphia a little bit, because I love that town, I love that city, and I really just love the people that are there. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, and we're going to look at a couple more minutes of old world images and interesting images, and then we'll just wrap it up at the end. In conclusion, I hope I was able to present to you some pretty thorough evidence of the old world in Philadelphia, to show you all the different melting pots of people that are said to have contributed to the history of Philadelphia. I just want to say thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing this time with me. Another thing I wanted to point out that was really important is many of you leave comments, and I read all of your comments, but sometimes I don't know what it is, but the comments don't always get posted under the video. So while I can read them and I get all your links and the things that you present to me, they won't always be displayed on the video. And that's not my doing. That's just something that's done by the powers that be. So I don't really have any control over that. But I don't want you to be discouraged from leaving your comments or sharing your links with me, because I am always receiving them and I am always appreciating them. I also wanted to say, definitely check out some of the people that I'm subscribed to. I don't subscribe to a lot of people on YouTube, but I do believe that the videos and the people that I give my time to on YouTube are very important, and they make very good content. So most of you are already subscribed to them, and that's how you found me. But if it is vice versa, I just wanted to give a shout out to all of them and say thank you for giving me these ideas, and thank you for inspiring me. I'm just really happy to be a Pennsylvanian talking about Philadelphia and being able to get my hands on some locked up images that some people have never seen before. So if you saw anything awesome or interesting in this video, let me know down below. And if you enjoyed or hated anything about this video, let me know down below. I'm always trying to do better. I'm always trying to make the best videos for you. And I'm taking my time to help us learn a little more about this old world history that I think we need to become more familiar with. So God bless America, and I will see you on the next video.